Welcome to Military Analytics. Ukrainian lands continue to witness the most violent war in world history. Russia's aggressive policies are trying to deprive Ukraine, one of the Eastern European countries, of its freedom. But the Ukrainian forces are struggling with all their might to prevent this brutal aim of the Russians from succeeding. The clashes and offensive operations on the battlefield this week showed that Ukraine will not easily give the Russians the opportunity to realize their invasion plan. Currently, Donetsk region is shown as the center of fierce clashes and hot contacts. The Ukrainian armed forces carried out a striking offensive operation yesterday in the city of Bakhmut, Donetsk region. The Russian forces, on the other hand, were forced to retreat from the suburbs of Bakhmut after these attacks by the Ukrainian army. It was announced that Ukrainian forces, which had taken most of the control of the city from the Russians, have now captured 85% of Bakhmut. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces made military preparations in the city of Makiivka. A few days ago, these preparations of the Ukrainian army signaled that a major offensive would take place on the eastern front lines. The reason for this was that the Ukrainian army was trying to blockade the Russian invaders in the Donetsk region from all directions. The Russians were aware of this situation, but it was not known exactly where and how the first attack would come. This uncertainty had already escalated the tension on the battlefield to its peak. In addition, the influx of the most special and elite units of the Ukrainian armed forces towards the Donetsk region was considered as a harbinger of a serious operation in this region. As you know, a huge 1,700-strong battalion of the Azov Special Forces had recently arrived in Bakhmut, a fortress city in Donetsk, eastern Ukraine, to support the Ukrainian army already with the arrival of Azov troops in the city. The Ukrainian army began to achieve striking victories against the invading soldiers in Bakhmut. On the other hand, the city of Volodar, located in the southwest of Bakhmut and currently considered one of the most critical front lines, is among the settlements liberated by the Ukrainian forces. The Russians were dealt a serious blow with the capture of Volodar by the Ukrainian army. The clashes here lasted for a whole week. As a result, the Ukrainians managed to take control of Volodar. Among the most influential factors in the capture of this city by the Ukrainian forces were the HIMARS long-range missile systems. Artillery of the Ukrainian army primarily used HIMARS missiles to destroy the trenches of Russian soldiers in the southern district of Volodar. As a result of the successful shootings, the Russian troops left their trenches in Volodar and began to retreat. Then the special forces and elite units of the Ukrainian army appeared on the scene. These special forces quietly and slowly infiltrated the Russian positions in southern Volodar. Then the Ukrainian special units, which suddenly caught the invading troops exactly where they were hiding, started the offensive operation to completely remove the Russians from Volodar. The Russian troops were surprised and began to retreat towards the southern suburbs of the city of Volodar. But the Ukrainian forces in no way stopped their offensive operations and increased the intensity of their attacks to drive the Russian invaders out of these suburbs as well. The last Ukrainian army carried out a massive attack on this city a few days ago. As a result of this attack, the Russians, who had to withdraw from the southern suburbs of Volodar, left the control of the city to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, had the opportunity to revive the connection between the central city of Donetsk and Volodar by taking control of a huge city, especially at such a critical time. However, the Ukrainians suffered serious losses to capture this city. Despite the critical situation of the units of the armed forces of Ukraine holding Volodar, the Ukrainian army still managed to seize control of the main supply routes of the city, turn its forces, and strengthen the defense of the city with almost all of its special battalions. On the other hand, it is known that the troops of the Russian army started intense clashes for Volodar today, but the Ukrainian troops managed to stop the attack despite serious losses. However, the transfer of additional Ukrainian troops to Volodar and the rotation of forces may indicate that the Ukrainian army are again preparing for a counterattack. That is according to the sources of the Telegram channel. Come and look. However, it is not clear at the moment where the location will be. Volodar is considered one of the most vulnerable cities controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces, and possible further attacks in this region could lead to the city being surrounded and taken under control by Russian troops. However, Considering that the Ukrainian armed forces have sent their long-range artillery and HIMARS systems which have a great impact in open areas, the possibility of Russian troops reoccupying Volodar decreases. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces need much more military ammunition and vehicles to hold other cities and settlements they have recaptured from the Russians, including Volodar. One of the most curious subjects in this regard was Germany's Leopard tanks. Yesterday, the Berlin government made a very striking statement on this issue. In fact, the eyes of the whole world were focused on this decision to come from Germany. The German government has announced that it will send at least 100 Leopard 1 type tanks to Ukraine in the coming months. After the Leopard 2 tanks, Germany approved the export of Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine. The new defense minister of Germany, Boris Pistorius, met with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. Making a statement after the visit, Pistorius stated that at least 100 Leopard 1 main battle tanks will be delivered to Ukraine by the first or second quarter of 2024. Pistorius stated that Ukraine will buy Leopard 1A5 main battle tanks from several European countries. Pistorius' visit to Kiev was his first major trip abroad since taking office. During the visit, which was kept secret for security reasons, Pistorius met with Zelensky as well as Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov. Reznikov shared a photo on Twitter showing himself with Pistorius and a model tank. And under this photo, Reznikov wrote that the first Leopard 2 had arrived in Kiev. A statement from the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine explained that the number of Leopard 1A5 main battle tanks that will actually be delivered to the Ukrainian army will depend on the necessary repair work. In addition, in the joint statement made by the defense ministries of Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark, it was guaranteed that the necessary logistical support and training would be provided for the Leopard 1 tanks to be sent to the Ukrainian army. On the other hand, Canadian Defense Minister Annette Annand announced that the first Leopard 2 main battle tank has arrived in Poland. Considering all this military support, a striking truth emerges. Weapons systems, which were considered taboo at the beginning of the occupation, are being sent to Ukraine one after another. First, the HIMARS multiple rocket launcher system, then the Patriot air defense missiles, and finally, the Leopard 2 and Abrams main battle tanks were put into service for Ukraine. Kiev is now after American-made 16s. The demand for warplanes is not new, although it is firmly on the agenda after the decision to send tanks. Ukraine's demand for Su-24, Su-25, Su-27, and MiG-29 dates back to the first weeks of the war almost a year ago, as seen in the tank debate. NATO allies are now divided over whether it would be wise to send fighter jets to Ukraine. US President Joe Biden, who previously refused to send Abrams, seems to have adopted the same stance for F-16s. Poland, one of the most enthusiastic about aircraft, has announced that it will act with its NATO allies. France left the door ajar provided that the supply was not escalatory and the planes did not strike Russian soil. The UK and Germany are not in favor of sending planes. The reason why Ukraine insists on F-16s, which some air forces have started to remove from their inventory, is based on similar reasons, as it prefers Leopard 2 tanks. Kiev demands 200 planes. F-16s are used by more than 25 countries, including Turkey. This means that a large pool can be created. The Ukrainian war has so far followed a ground-oriented course rather than in the air. Considering the training period of the pilots, it is questioned whether planes are a priority. Some experts argue that even a small number of Western warplanes can have a significant deterrent effect. Ukraine plans to move from defensive to offensive operations in the spring. It is thought that the planes could help support this attempt or help curb Russia, which is preparing for an intense attack. It seems that the USA will play the key role in the F-16 story, which seems to be continuing, although it is desirable to see how the situation on the ground will develop before committing to a new step. It is not unlikely that an aircraft coalition will be established for the Ukraine after the creation of the tank coalition. Victory is always on the back of the sword, on the tip of the bayonet. In other words, it's the leaders, not the politicians, who make the revolution and the popular power and army fighting for their freedom. Currently, we see the most real and striking example of this situation in the steppes of Ukraine, where the snow has begun to melt. Let's take a look at the general situation on the front lines of this stunning war, and how the Ukrainian forces changed the course of the war with their offensive operation in a surprise area. Let's start with a general assessment of the battlefield first. Russian troops continue their offensive in the west of the city of Luhansk, Bakhmut, and Donetsk in the operation to seize the Donbas region and Zaporizhia. The Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, are strengthening their defense in all these regions. Day by day, it is seen that the Russian troops are trying to increase the speed of the operation in order to seize the region up the Oskil River in the north and in the Donbas administrative border in the south, in order to complete the operation as soon as possible. The Ukrainian forces are also planning where they will use the tanks and armored vehicles coming from the west as they continue their defense and offensive preparations for the alleged counterattacks by the Russians in the spring. In addition, the Ukrainian Land Forces Command formed new units consisting of 7 mechanized infantry brigades, 2 maritime infantry brigades, 1 Jaeger brigade, 1 assault brigade, and 1 artillery brigade for operations in swamps and forests. We can state that these units were formed to compensate for the casualties or gathered for the Ukrainian general counteroffensive, which was announced to be made in the spring. We can say that the tanks and armored vehicles that will probably come from the west will be given to these units. On the other hand, Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of the main intelligence agency of Ukraine, stated that the Ukrainian army will launch a counterattack in the spring, and one of the strategic goals will be an attempt to cut the land corridor between Russia and Crimea. In addition, Russia deployed 30 warplanes and 370 helicopters in Crimea and near the Ukrainian border. Skibitsky emphasized that Ukraine needs warplanes to destroy them. The chief of the General Staff of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, declared that he believes that Ukraine will take Mariupol back in 2023 as the Crimean plan of the Ukrainian forces continued the direction of offensive operations and violent clashes began to shift towards the Luhansk region. The surprise location that we earlier mentioned, the Ukrainians broke through the Russian defenses for 6 kilometers at Kremenna, one of the most critical front lines in the Luhansk region. The Ukrainians, who managed to completely change the course of the battle in Donbas with this striking offensive operation, gained a great advantage on the battlefield. Let's dive into the most critical and important moments of this stunning Ukrainian operation that took place in Kremenna. If you remember, in the city of Kremenna, one of the most critical front lines of the Luhansk region, the Ukrainians formed a powerful single-line defensive fortification with a huge tank battalion and infantry units similar to the old war tactics. It was clear that this shield woven by the brave soldiers of the Ukrainians would put a lot of pressure on the Russians. However, the army of the Russian leader, who wanted to take his chances, tried to stop the Ukrainian advance in the direction of Kremenna and began to actively dispatch armored vehicles and infantry units in the direction of Svardov. The first attack came from Putin's soldiers in Kremenna. However, the Ukrainian forces managed to repel these attacks by Russian soldiers who were looking for victory with the old Stalingrad tactics. Since Russia's armored vehicle and infantry unit support did not work, a sharp dead silence began to prevail on the front line after these attacks within a few hours. It was the counterattack of the Ukrainian forces that broke the unsettling silence after the unsuccessful Russian attacks. The Free Ukrainian Army, which started artillery fire in the frontal battle spreading to the forested areas, blew up 3 IFs belonging to the Russian army. As a result of these counterattacks, the black smoke and embers of flames that emerged with the blowing up of these 3 Russian infantry fighting vehicles that reached Kremenna as a support force were recorded as the clearest moments revealing the true face of the war. Ukraine was determined to make history in Kremenna. At present, Russian battleships and reinforcements continued to arrive from the start of front line, while the Ukrainian forces continued their determined hold in the city in Kremenna, a hot contact area where the sounds of bombs, missiles, and gunfire have not ceased for about a week, where the soldiers of both sides clashed at a distance of 150 meters. The Russians wanted to smash this shield built by the Ukrainians. After this first unsuccessful attack of the Russians, Putin's army in Crimea, unable to tolerate the Ukrainian forces' counterattack and knocking out 3 Russian armored vehicles, tried another attack attempt. The Russian infantry and battleships which flocked to Crimea from Stutthof were advancing through the forested areas of the city, which had turned into complete chaos from the sound of gunfire. The wooded areas concealed the Ukrainians' trenches, while the Russian battleships had to penetrate deep into the forested terrain to launch an attack. Advancing through the Crimean woodland where tree branches obscured the sky and turning the daylight into darkness, Russian battleships came under crossfire from Ukrainian soldiers. Despite this, the Russian battleships had to advance. A big explosion occurred in this area where geographical conditions dragged the Russians into the swamp. It was reported that 2 more Russian battleships were blown up after the explosion. The Russians were about to regret their attempt to break through the Ukrainian defenses in Crimea. We think that in a short period of time, 5 Russian infantry vehicles disintegrated and burned to heat the forested land. And we think that Russian troops began to sweat in the cold weather before the spring season. Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, continued to advance through the forest after destroying the Russian infantry vehicles. Clashes in Crimea have actually a lot of importance. The desire of the Ukrainians to dominate both the city and Stadiv, located in the north of the city, aims to cut off the logistical support from the Russian borders. The Ukrainian army, which has generally been advancing in its war strategy in this direction for a long time, has been successful in this method so far. If we look at the tragic loss of more than 160,000 soldiers of the Russian army, we can understand the sad situation for the Russians much more clearly. On the other hand, it's stated that there are 3 systems that ensure success in the operation of the Ukrainian armed forces against Russia and affect the battlefield. The first is the Javelin, a shoulder-fired guided anti-tank missile that can be used by a single person effectively against the Russian armed forces. Secondly, we come across the HIMARS long-range missile system. HIMARS. The full name of the U.S. Army is the M142 High Motion Artillery Rocket System. The U.S. Army describes it as a full-spectrum battle, proven all-weather 24/7 deadly and responsive wheeled precision strike weapon system. HIMARS was used very effectively against the Russian targets, especially after the second 6 months of the operation. The last one is Bayraktar DB-2 armed unmanned aerial vehicle. These stunning UAVs have become one of the world's most well-known unmanned aerial vehicles due to their use in the Ukrainian operations field. With its effective use, it has been described as incapacitating Russian armored units, fire support systems, and supply lines. According to the open-source intelligence website, 17 of the 4250 TB2 Ukraine received appeared to have been destroyed in the war, while Ukraine's military equipment that ensures success is increasing day by day. Russia is going backwards militarily. Efforts by the Russian Ministry of Defense to establish the Russian Combat Army Reserve or BARS 2021 in August 2021 aimed at recruiting 100,000 volunteer reservists for 3 years of contract service failed. They probably failed to encourage ex-servicemen of the Russian army to join their ranks. Ukrainian officials reported that the Russian military command only brought about 7,000 BARS soldiers into battle, possibly indicating that the Russian Ministry of Defense was not able to recruit the desired number of reservists before the war. It should not be forgotten that every country with a contracted professional army will encounter problems in supplying such personnel and meeting its casualties. It should also be foreseen that there will be serious difficulties in recruiting personnel, especially in cases with the high amount of personnel casualties, the failure to capture the operational targets in a reasonable time, and the execution of the operation on the territory of another country. However, it is clear that Russia cannot think about this issue sufficiently and what measures should be taken regarding the problem. The day there was a lot of news from the east here. Russian forces rapidly increased the usage of aviation and started demolishing key Ukrainian defensive positions with Arab bombs. However, Ukrainians quickly took action and improved their anti-aircraft warfare by providing the Bakhmut group with self-propelled but also man-portable air defense systems. So Russians quickly noticed the spike in losses of drones and put on hold their planned bombing. Last time I told you that in order to avoid devastating losses during the storming operation of the most fortified part of Bakhmut, Russians started utilizing Fab 500 air-dropped bombs. I also told you that in response to this new development, apart from reinforcing the region with air defense, Ukrainians created mobile units that hunt on Russian aviation from balconies. The freshest reports indicate that these actions brought results. A fighter from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade reported that the usage of Fab 500 significantly decreased. He said that it is highly likely due to the increased density of Ukrainian air defense in the region and overall better tension to the sky. The fighter also alluded to the recent powerful Ukrainian strikes on Russian positions west of the barracks and said that such strikes started to happen quite frequently and caused similar to 500-500 destruction. But to Russians, such precision strikes successfully complicated Russian logistics in the northern part of Bakhmut and forced them to take time to regroup. Due to the process of regrouping, the pressure from this line was alleviated and Russians have not gained new ground. In turn, several Russian sources suggested that Ukrainians created a small buffer zone between the residential area and the barracks. When it comes to the central part, Ukrainians assume strong positions east of the Department of the Engineering Academy and Medical College. Combat footage from this region showed how Wagner unit attempted to cross Pavlovo-Novgorodskaya Street but was immediately destroyed. A bit east of this location, another combat footage showed how Ukrainian drone operators cooperated with the mortar crew and destroyed another assault unit. They spotted how Russian troops in small numbers accumulated in the building and then conducted a strike in the southern part of the region. The situation is the most challenging for Ukrainians. For a long time this area was the most stable. But the moment things stabilized in the north, they deteriorated along Korsun and Skarva Street. The main goal of Russian assault units in this region was to establish control over the industrial college and split Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut into groups. A fighter from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade reported that Russians devoted an absurdly high number of troops to this operation. He said that over the last day, the control over the college changed 3 times. The chronology was the following: Russians prepared assault units consisting of at least 20 troops and sent one assault unit after another until Ukrainians got overwhelmed and retreated. Then Ukrainians reduced Russians with artillery and conducted a counterattack. And then the cycle repeated 2 more times. The drone footage showed that due to the intense fights, the college was turned into a barrel stand in Kharkiv. As you can see, when it comes to intense street fighting, the front line is always very unstable, and the control over entire residential quarters can go back and forth several times during the day. In the face of such high uncertainty, Ukrainians started destroying possible key Russian positions. Recently, Ukrainian sources published a video of a controlled explosion of a high-rise building on the outer edge of the city. Some sources speculated that these positions were lost and Ukrainians tried to blow up Wagner's. However, the building was empty and Ukrainians are still controlling these positions, which is confirmed by today's footage filmed from a vehicle that used the Nevsky Highway to deliver supplies to Bakhmut. The reason why Ukrainians destroyed it is the following: this building does not give fire control over Russian positions because it is blocked by other buildings. So it has no value for Ukrainians apart from being used for storage. However, if by any chance Russians take it, then this building would allow them to establish multiple ADM positions and destroy absolutely all vehicles moving between Bakhmut and Chasiv. So Ukrainians blew it up just in case, while they continue holding other buildings to control the region. Ukrainian fighters also made an interesting observation and reported that the number of regular Russian forces has substantially decreased and 90% of soldiers are from the Wagner group. A few days ago, the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, said in an interview that his private military company is losing 5 times as many men as he expected today. He also said that Wagner Group is on the verge of extinction, and he underscored that he's not being alarmist and that people will soon see for themselves. It looks like the commanders of the regular Russian forces understood that they will not be able to quickly finish the battle and take all the credit, and once again left it to the Wagners to take all the losses. After the notorious video of the decapitation of a Ukrainian soldier, Wagner forces understood that they will not be taken captive in order to improve the morale of the Wagner fighters. Prigozhin gave orders not to take captives as well and kill all Ukrainians. He used audio where speaker alluded to killing a wounded Wagner soldier to justify his decision. But Ukrainian fighters seem to be unfazed about this news. And even though some people express concern about the stability of the last defense line, many fighters are confident that Wagner forces will land before Bakhmut falls, and they are certain that it is impossible to take Bakhmut by the 9th of May. The 9th of May is the day of victory in the Second World War, and Russian command is set to make a symbolic surprise by taking Bakhmut before this holiday. Ukrainian command is also preparing a surprise over the last month. Ukrainian commanders made several visits to Bakhmut, and since the start of April, many Ukrainian fighters started alluding to a certain surprise that has been prepared for Russians in Bakhmut. It's been speculated that Ukrainian high command is preparing something substantial.